May 14, 1945. Landsberg Prison, Bavaria, Germany. Europe's war had ended 6 days earlier. Across the world, people celebrated victory. Paris overflowed with cheering crowds. London rang with church bells that had been silent for years. In New York, strangers embraced in the streets while soldiers kissed women they had never met before. But inside Landsberg Prison, there was no joy waiting. Only a narrow stone cell, a metal bucket in the corner, a single cot beneath a dim light, and a man sitting motionless on its edge, knowing he would be dead by sunrise. SS Obersturmbannführer Heinrich Roth had once commanded an Einsatzgruppen killing unit operating across Eastern Europe. His column had swept through Poland and Ukraine with ruthless efficiency, leaving burned villages, shattered families, and mass graves behind them. During the tribunal, 4 days had been spent examining the evidence against him. Witnesses who survived his operations testified in detail. Photographs were presented. Coordinates of burial pits were entered into record. Signed execution orders written in Roth's own hand were laid out before the judges. After deliberating for less than 2 hours, the tribunal reached its conclusion. Death by hanging. Execution scheduled for 0600 hours, May 15. Roth accepted the sentence without visible emotion. He had belonged to the SS since 1936. He had endured the Eastern Front and watched the collapse of the Reich from within. By the time judgment came, he had already accepted the certainty of death. What he could not accept was disappearing without explanation, without legacy, without history remembering him on his own terms. At the end of the trial, he had been granted permission to make a final statement. He used that moment carefully. Standing rigid before the American officers, he delivered words that climbed through the military command structure within hours. I was a soldier. I obeyed orders. History will decide whether those orders were wrong, not me. I am no different from any man in this room who has ever fired a weapon because he was told to. The atmosphere inside the courtroom changed instantly. The presiding officer ordered the statement removed from the official record. Guards escorted Roth away, but the damage had already been done. The words reached one man who could not ignore them. General George S. Patton. Late on the evening of May 14, with only 6 hours remaining before Roth's execution, Patton's staff car arrived outside the gates of Landsberg Prison. No one had requested his presence. No orders directed him there. The visit had not been arranged through official channels. He came on his own. And what took place inside that prison cell that night, what Patton said to a condemned SS commander during the final hours before his death, remained with every guard who overheard it for the rest of their lives. To understand why Patton came, you first have to understand the kind of man Heinrich Roth was, and why Patton viewed his statement as something that demanded an answer. Roth was not a fanatic in the loud, obvious sense. He had not spent the early years of the Nazi movement screaming propaganda in the streets. He was not one of the reckless ideologues who built their identity around rage alone. In many ways, he was far more dangerous than that. Roth was educated, disciplined, and intellectually convinced of the beliefs he carried. Born in Dresden in 1908, he came from a deeply military family. His father had served with distinction during the First World War. His grandfather had worn the uniform under Bismarck. In the Roth household, military duty was treated almost like sacred inheritance. When Heinrich Roth entered the SS in 1936, he was not a desperate man seeking survival or influence. He held a university degree in law. He possessed social connections and opportunities outside politics. What drew him to the SS was not necessity. It was belief. He wanted to devote himself to a cause he considered worthy of sacrifice, and he found that cause inside the ideology of racial warfare. By 1941, when the Einsatzgruppen followed German forces into the Soviet Union, Roth had become fully committed to that worldview. He did not see himself as cruel for cruelty's sake. In his own mind, he was carrying out a mission justified by logic, history, and necessity. He managed his unit with cold administrative precision. Reports were filed carefully. Numbers were recorded methodically. Execution orders were signed with the detached efficiency of office paperwork. The killing became systematic, organized, bureaucratic. To Roth, it was not chaos. It was duty. That was what made his tribunal statement so disturbing. He had not stood in court defending murder openly. Instead, he attempted something far more calculated. He erased the distinction between himself and ordinary soldiers fighting on battlefields. I followed orders. I am no different from any man in this room who has ever pulled a trigger on command. It was false, but carefully constructed falsehoods are often the most dangerous kind. And Patton believed it required a response. On the evening of May 13, Patton received the transcript containing Roth's statement. He read it once in silence. Then he folded the paper, reopened it, and read it again. General Hobart Gay, Patton's chief of staff, later recalled the unusual silence that followed. Patton was not known for restraint. Most things provoked immediate reaction from him. But after finishing the transcript a second time, he said nothing for nearly a minute. Finally, he asked a single question. "Where is he being held?" "Landsberg," Gay answered. "Execution tomorrow morning." Patton folded the papers carefully and slid them into his jacket pocket. "I'm going there," he said. Gay attempted to dissuade him. The military process was already complete. The verdict had been delivered. There was no practical purpose in visiting a condemned SS officer hours before his execution. It risked attention, questions, and unnecessary controversy. Patton listened to the argument without interruption. Then he answered. He stood in that courtroom and claimed he was no different from us. I'm going to tell him exactly why he's wrong. And I want him to understand it before he dies. Gay did not argue again. 40 minutes later, Patton's car was driving through the Bavarian darkness toward Landsberg prison. The prison itself already carried history long before 1945. In 1924, Adolf Hitler had been imprisoned there after the failed Beer Hall Putsch. It was inside those walls that he wrote much of Mein Kampf. When American troops captured the facility in April 1945, the symbolism was impossible to miss. Now the same prison housed SS officers and war criminals who had built their lives around the ideology born inside those pages. When Patton arrived, the officer on duty nearly lost grip of the clipboard in his hands. Nobody had warned the prison staff. No escort had been assembled. No preparations existed for the general's arrival. Patton entered with 2 aides and a military policeman. He instructed the duty officer to take him directly to Roth's cell and ordered everyone to leave once the door was opened. The officer hesitated. Regulations required a guard to remain present during any interaction with prisoners awaiting execution. Patton stared at him with the kind of look that usually ended arguments immediately. "You can wait outside the door," he said. "Now move." The officer moved. Roth was awake when the cell opened. He sat upright on the edge of the cot wearing his SS uniform, which the tribunal had allowed him to keep. His posture remained rigid. Whatever else Heinrich Roth was, he had no intention of spending his last night collapsed in fear against a prison wall. The moment he saw Patton, something flickered across his face. Not surprise exactly. More calculation. Even now, Roth's mind searched for meaning, advantage, interpretation. Patton stepped inside. Behind him, the door remained open. One aide stayed near the entrance while the duty officer stood unseen in the corridor close enough to hear every word spoken. For several long seconds, neither man said anything. Patton studied Roth the same way he had studied the bodies inside Dachau weeks earlier, with cold concentration and complete attention, as though trying to understand something terrible before deciding what judgment it deserved. Roth returned the stare without flinching. He had survived Kursk and the Eastern Front. He was not going to lower his eyes before an American general in a prison cell. At last, Patton broke the silence. "You made a statement during your tribunal. I read it." Roth remained silent. "You said you were a soldier. You said you followed orders. You said you were no different from the men judging you because they had also killed under command." Still nothing. But the muscles in Roth's jaw tightened slightly. "I came here to explain why you're wrong," Patton continued. "Not for your sake. You'll be dead in 6 hours. I'm saying it because somebody needs to say it out loud in this room." What followed did not sound like a speech. Patton was not reciting prepared lines. Witnesses later described it as something stripped of ceremony entirely. Calm. Direct. Personal. Like a man finishing an argument that had been waiting years for an answer. He began with the word soldier. "You called yourself a soldier. I've spent 30 years learning what that word actually means. A soldier fights other soldiers. He advances, retreats, holds ground, loses ground. He faces an enemy capable of killing him back. That mutual danger is what separates war from murder. Risk exists on both sides. Do you understand that?" Roth finally answered. His English was careful and precise. "I understand your definition. I simply reject the idea that it is the only one." Patton nodded slowly. "Yes. I know you reject it. That's exactly the problem. Because your definition only works if you first convince yourself the people you killed were less than human. Everything else depended on that lie." He stepped closer to the cot. "Not aggressively. Deliberately. The men under my command fought in North Africa, Sicily, France. They knew the Germans shooting at them had families, mothers, children, lives worth something. They killed anyway because war forced them to. But they never needed to pretend the enemy stopped being human." Roth's expression changed. The calculating look disappeared, replaced by something colder. "What you did," Patton continued, "required you to erase humanity first. Villages full of civilians with no weapons, no uniforms, no chance to defend themselves, and you convinced yourself they were military targets. You called it war." Patton paused. "It wasn't war." Silence stretched between them. Finally Roth spoke again, quieter now but still controlled. "History belongs to the victors, General. You stand here because your side won." "That's true," Patton answered immediately. "We did win." Then he leaned forward slightly. "Do you know why?" He didn't wait for a reply. "Not because we were more brutal than you. Not because we were willing to become monsters first. We won because we understood something you didn't. We understood what a human being is." His voice remained level. "You built an entire military system around the idea that some people were disposable. We built ours trying to bring our men home alive. I spent 4 years trying to end battles quickly because every extra day meant more of my soldiers buried in the ground." He stopped speaking for a moment. Then he looked directly into Roth's eyes. "That's the difference between us. Not the weapon. Not the order. The reason." For almost a minute Roth said nothing. When he finally answered, the calmness in his voice had weakened slightly. "You came here to tell me I was wrong." "No," Patton replied. "I came here to tell you something else. Something I want you thinking about before morning." He removed the folded tribunal transcript from his pocket and held it up. "You told the courtroom history would judge the orders, not the man carrying them out. You said that because you didn't want responsibility resting on your own shoulders. I understand why you said it. But you misunderstood something important." Patton slid the paper back into his jacket. "History already judged you." The words hung in the air. "That's why you're sitting in this cell. That's why your signed orders are buried inside evidence files beside photographs of mass graves." History didn't wait 50 years. It arrived the moment my soldiers walked into those camps and started recording what they found. Roth stared at the floor without speaking. The people your unit murdered, Patton continued, his voice quieter now, their names are being written down already. Survivors are talking. Entire teams of people are documenting every village, every family, every grave. Their stories will outlive the Reich. They'll outlive the ideology you served. They'll outlive every banner and slogan you gave your life to. Another pause. And you, Patton said, will only survive in those records as the man who signed the orders. He turned toward the cell door. At the threshold, Patton stopped and looked back one final time. Roth remained seated upright on the cot, but something inside him had changed. Not panic. Not collapse. Something quieter than that. Something hollowed out. Patton's face showed neither hatred nor pity. Only final judgment. Then he spoke again. You told that courtroom you were no different from the soldiers who followed my orders. Think about this tonight. Every soldier I ever commanded is going home to somebody who loves him. They'll have children. They'll grow old. When they die someday, people will mourn them. His eyes never left Roth. The men whose orders you obeyed are either dead already or waiting in cells for the same rope waiting for you. The Reich is gone. Your cause is gone. Everything you devoted your life to has collapsed into rubble. His voice lowered. And tomorrow morning, you'll hang here alone. No crowds outside these gates. No grieving family honoring your sacrifice. Because that's the difference between a soldier and what you became. One final silence. A soldier fights for something that deserves to survive after he's gone. You fought for something that deserved destruction. And deep down, at the very end, you know it. Patton opened the door. That's all I came to say. Then he walked out. The cell door closed behind him. At 0600 hours on May 15, 1945, Heinrich Roth was executed by hanging at Landsberg prison. Witnesses later said he walked to the gallows without speaking. Patton never officially documented the visit. No diary entry from May 14 mentioned Landsberg. Letters sent to his wife, Beatrice, during that period made no reference to it either. The meeting was never classified or hidden. Patton simply chose not to record it. But the guards who stood outside that cell remembered. Years later, they quietly described what they had heard to historians and family members. One of them, an Ohio sergeant named Walter Crane, eventually gave a recorded interview in 1978. He recalled standing outside the cell door during the entire exchange. According to Crane, the most unforgettable part was not Patton's words. It was what happened afterward. After the general left, Crane said, I checked through the slot in the door like procedure required. Roth was sitting exactly where he'd been before. Same posture. But he had both hands covering his face. Crane paused during the interview before continuing. That was the only time I ever saw him do that. During his entire stay in that prison, he never once put his face in his hands. Another pause. I can't tell you what it meant. Maybe it wasn't remorse. Maybe it was something else entirely. I wasn't inside his mind. But whatever Patton said in there, it reached him. Most stories about Patton focus on battlefield victories, armored advances, dramatic speeches, and the image he carefully built around himself. The visit to Landsberg revealed something different. Something quieter, but more important. Patton understood that wars are fought not only with weapons, but with meaning. Armies survive on the stories they tell themselves about why they kill and what separates necessity from atrocity. Roth's statement had been dangerous precisely because it tried to erase that separation completely. I am no different from any man in this room. That argument attempted to place battlefield combat and systematic civilian extermination into the same moral category under the excuse of obedience. Patton refused to let that idea stand unanswered. Not because he thought Roth could still change. The execution was hours away. Roth was beyond redemption, beyond persuasion, beyond rehabilitation. Patton went because some truths need to be spoken directly to the person most responsible, even when nothing can be changed anymore. That kind of moral seriousness is different from legal justice. It is not punishment. It is not revenge. It is the insistence that truth be spoken plainly before the final door closes. Whether Roth truly understood those words during his final night is impossible to know. What is certain is that Patton believed the confrontation mattered enough to drive through the Bavarian night and deliver it himself. And the question left behind by that story is not really about Patton at all. It is about the line he insisted existed. Is there a real difference between a soldier killing another armed soldier in combat and a commander organizing systematic murder against civilians? Most people answer yes immediately. But Roth's argument, horrifying as it was, challenged that certainty. He argued that obedience is obedience. That institutions create violence, not individuals. That responsibility dissolves upward through chains of command. Patton rejected that entirely. His answer was not legal. It was moral. The reason matters. The target matters. The humanity you recognize, or refuse to recognize, in the people on the other side matters. That distinction is what separates warfare from atrocity. Roth died either believing history would someday vindicate him, or pretending to believe it until the end. History never did. The names of the people murdered by his unit are still being recovered. Mass graves are still being identified. Records are still being studied. Families are still learning what happened to relatives who vanished during the war. At least in that sense, Patton was right. History already made its judgment.